Hi, in today's lecture, I want to talk about the Renaissance and Reformation towards modernity. This is our last lecture for the semester, and the last lecture in this remote learning mode. I want to defer to the textbook quite a bit. By here, I want to develop a couple of points that the textbook doesn't talk about, and give you my own interpretations on a few matters, and then provide you a greater context for the textbook. In general, I want you to dwell on chapter 12 in the Bachman textbook, which has, in the same chapter, a very good succinct overview of the Renaissance and the Reformation. It's one of the best I've seen in a short, brief textbook. So let's start. And again, my point in doing this is to make this relevant for you as you study for your final exam, which we'll talk about separately. So the Renaissance and the Reformation, in the old school, they used to call us the Ren-Ref, period. The period marks a transition from the Middle Ages and the medieval world into the modern world. So that's the starting point. I want to talk a little bit what we mean by this. Clearly, the world in 1600 is much different than the world in 1400. The world in 1650 is a lot different than the world in 1350. For centuries, things changed very slowly. And all of a sudden, we see huge changes going on in many different areas. The Renaissance and Reformation periods mark the beginning of what historians refer to as the early modern period of European history, and it marks a new phase in Western civilization. Modern history starts really with the late 1700s, the French Revolution and industrialization. So we use the word early modern. There are continuities and discontinuities. There are some things that stay the same as they had been in the medieval world, but there are big discontinuities as well. The discovery, for Europeans anyway, of the New World after 1492 is a big one, as is the Protestant Reformation beginning in 1517. But there are also continuities going on as well. One final point. When I say the word modernity, I simply mean the condition of being modern. It's a word that's used in historians' vocabularies, and philosophers use this term, and sociologists as well. Modernity is the condition of being modern. Well, what is this condition of being modern? What do we mean by modern? Well, I'm going to stick here to Europe. I'm just going to talk about a few different themes. So one thing, Europe begins to stretch its control over the entire world. The New World in particular, in the Americas, North America, South America, the Caribbean, Central America, Africa, in terms of the slave trade eventually, and later on, the East as well. Second point, we see the rise of a middle class, which had been developing for some time. It's still small in the High Middle Ages, in the 11th century, 12th century, 13th century, but now the middle class is beginning to take off. These are people who are not connected to the land. They're not in a feudal relationship with a lord. They might be individual professional people or tradesmen, and they're living in towns, or what they would call them cities, of course. The rise of a middle class is an extremely important theme. We see the rise of a modern centralized state. At first, this is led by kings. Queen Elizabeth, being one example. King Louis XIV being another example a little bit later on. And then eventually with representative governments, with a professional military, a professional standing army. We also see some new technological developments. In particular, the clock is very important. I won't talk much about that. The printing press is hugely important. There are improvements in navigation that make possible the European movement around the entire world. The cannon and firearms are incredibly important. These are all very crucial for this new emerging state system. Things like the telescope are also very important. So there are a number of technological improvements in this time period as well. We can also talk about the rise of capitalism. This is more relevant for the second half of this course. But by the we get to the 1400s and 1500s, we can see the roots of capitalism with banking and investment and modern accounting techniques. And of course, by the late 18th century, we see industrialization. Industrialization is happening in a small way right now, but we would not call the manufacturing facilities now industrial factories. That hasn't happened yet. But capitalism is beginning. We see a new scientific attitude marked by the beginnings of the scientific revolution with Copernicus, culminating with Newton and others. We see a split in Christianity with the Reformation, leading to various forms of Protestantism and the end of the church's dominance over cultural life. We see the beginning of a modern city, Paris, London, Rome, places that we can identify with today. And we see increased urbanization, which brings problems as well as benefits. We see an increase in individualism gradually, doesn't happen all at once, in terms of thought. People begin to think of themselves as individuals, not necessarily embedded in a network of medieval social relations, and intellectually they think of themselves as free-thinking people. Finally, we see the rise of the modern nation state. Places that we can identify on a map and say, aha, this is England, this is France, and eventually we'll see the rise of nationalism. But that's more in the second part of this course. Let's go to the Renaissance first. Italy is the center stage for this. It's kind of the center of the world. Different countries occupy center stage at different points, and this is Italy's turn for us to look at. Why Italy? There are a lot of different factors here. We see city-states that emerge that are ruled by strong men and by powerful families. Trade is very important. We see a concentration of wealth. A lot of this has to do with the Roman background, We see new forms of post-feudalism political power beginning to emerge. So it's in Italy that we see the earliest vestiges of the earliest roots, I should say, of the Renaissance. Later on, we can talk about the Renaissance in the north. It happens a little bit later in places like Germany, the Netherlands, and England. Shakespeare, who's much later in this time period, would be representative of the very tail end of the Renaissance in the north, in England. So a couple words about historiography, how historians look at history. Historians used to look at the Renaissance as the great dividing line between the medieval world and the modern world. This is no longer the case. This is certainly, however, how Renaissance thinkers would have thought of themselves. They would have seen themselves as the reenactment of the greatness that was Greece and Rome, and they were very self-conscious, and they would have thought that they were the greatest thing since sliced bread. But it's really in the early 19th century that we see modern historians looking at this Renaissance as the Great Rebirth. In particular, the Swiss historian who wrote in German, Jacob Burckhardt, in his famous 2-volume work, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, talks about Italy as being a great dividing line. I'm not saying that Burckhardt was wrong, or the early historians are wrong, but there's a lot to be said about overstating their case. Today, we have a more nuanced look at it. And I would suggest that today the term Renaissance is still meaningful. Today, we kind of use it as an umbrella term, for much of what happens between the year 1400 and 1600. There's a few things that happened in the mid-1300s that would fall under the Renaissance, a few things in literature and the arts. There's a few things that happened after 1600. But in general, between 1400 and 1600, we see the essence of the Renaissance. And so we use the word Renaissance as an umbrella term to refer to this entire period of time. I'll talk more about this in a few minutes. The word Renaissance also applies to certain changes in art, literature, culture, and philosophy. So this is how we might even more specifically utilize the term the Renaissance literature, Renaissance art. Okay, I I do want to say one thing about printing, which the textbook, as much as I love our textbook, he doesn't spend enough time on this topic as I would like. And printing, I think, is very, very significant. The historian Elizabeth Eisenstein, in the early 1960s, wrote two very important articles on the significance of printing in the Renaissance, and later it was turned into a book, a huge book, 2-volume book. And she turned that into a couple other shorter books as well. Printing, Eisenstein argued, is the most significant develop in the Renaissance period of 1400 to 1600. The printing press, she says, and I'm paraphrasing the title of one of her articles, was an agent of social and intellectual change. Gutenberg, Johannes Gutenberg, began his work with movable type, utilizing a printing press, was based upon a grape press, squeezing down. You put ink on some type, you put a piece of paper on there, you squeeze it down, and you come up and you've got a piece of printed paper. You dry it, and then you can bind it with other pieces of paper. This begins around 1450. This dates are very fuzzy. But it spreads rapidly throughout Europe, so that by the year 1500, there are printing presses all around Europe, Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Western Europe, and in many cases, Eastern Europe as well. Without printing, says Eisenstein, the Renaissance would not have happened, the Reformation would not have happened, and the scientific revolution would not have happened. At least they would not have occurred as they did. Why is this the case? Well, previous Renaissances, like the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne, and the 11th century Renaissance and the 13th century Renaissance, they were not permanent. This Renaissance was significant because of the advent of printing. We see the rise of a print culture, Eisenstein says. We see something called typographical fixity. In other words, we are taking a text, let's say it's Homer's Odyssey, and it's now being printed, or the Bible is being printed. Now there's no more change going on. This particular sentence from Homer or the Bible is fixed forever. There's also a huge increase in the distribution of books. And this means the establishment of a reading public and the spread of humanist learning during the Renaissance. It allowed the ideas of the Renaissance thinkers to spread. As far as the Reformation is concerned, it allowed the ideas of Protestant reformers to spread. If Martin Luther didn't have printing, one wonders how far widespread his revolution in Christianity would have gone. The spread of Bibles written in the vernacular languages, English, French, German, Dutch, was amazing. And these things could be read by everyone right now, which means, of course, a larger reading public than ever before. It allowed the circulation of old scientific works by people like Aristotle. And this led new scientists to see old errors in their thinking, and they developed new models of nature. This is certainly what happens with people like Copernicus and Galileo. It was their reading of old texts now made more available because everybody can look at the old works, and they start critiquing these things and saying, you know what? I think I have a better model to explain the physical universe. So no printing. The Renaissance, Reformation, and the scientific revolution might not have unfolded the way it did. Printing didn't cause these things to happen, but it enabled it to evolve in the way that it did. Now I want to talk a little bit about Renaissance art, because many people encounter the Renaissance as an artistic movement. We see a connection between art and power. I mean, money power and political power. Art was commissioned by the church and by wealthy people. Paintings are not done by somebody who's very talented who just wants to spend an afternoon drafting something. They're paid commissioned works. They weren't meant to be hung in museums. They're meant to be placed into people's homes or in cathedrals. So it's a very interesting connection. And Italy had that particular aspect of political power and wealth. They could commission great works. We see secular themes, classical themes from the ancient world. We also see religious themes as well as secular themes. There's a new use of perspective, the vanishing point. If you've ever taken the drawing class, artists like Leonardo da Vinci focus on close observation. He wrote widely about this, in fact. We see a celebration of the human spirit. So in my PowerPoint that accompanied this, I have a couple of paintings here. The first one is by Masolino, St. Peter healing a cripple in 1425. And this one has been edited by an editor to show the vanishing point in the distance, which gives us a sense of perspective, which makes the painting more realistic, more representational. This had already started in the late Middle Ages, okay? In the 1300s, we see people like Giotto doing things like this. But by the 1400s, we see this use of perspective very, very widespread. I have a picture on the slide show here of Raphael's The School of Athens. At the celebration of classical philosophy in ancient Greece. We see Plato and Aristotle walking in the middle of the frame here. Again, a very good use of the perspective here, but also a celebration of the greatest ideas of ancient Greece. We could look at Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, or the Proportions of Man, from 1490. Which has the arms outstretched on this particular figure. It's done with great mathematical precision and with the celebration of the human form in mind. This is very, very much part of the Renaissance spirit. We can look at Michelangelo's David, the great sculpture, again going back to Old Testament times, in 1504. It's a celebration of the perfect human form. If you look at the sculpture of David, you see him as he's nude. He's a very attractive male. He's been working out, he's muscular. This is an example of the human form as being beautiful. And finally, I have one more. This is from Michelangelo also, The Creation of Adam, 1512. And this is a fresco. I'm sure you've seen this with God touching the hand of Adam here. Man is made in God's image, quite obviously, implying human perfection. All very, very much part of the Renaissance theme in art. Renaissance thought, builds upon this spirit. There's a revival of classical learning from Greece and Rome. There's an expansion of the universities, which were founded in the High Middle Ages. There's a rise of an intellectual class of people who are scholars and writers. Even if they're not in the universities, they had patrons who would take care of them and provide them the free time, the leisure time to write. The key theme here is humanism, and I'll defer to the textbook on talking about humanism. Humanism, Renaissance humanism, is a celebration of the human spirit and of the human form. It's a cultivation of learning for its own sake, and it's cultivation of the well-rounded individual, the well-rounded person. And this is something new. This is definitely not medieval. It's something modern, and it's something that we could all relate to today. Other uses of the word Renaissance, moving beyond the intellectual, well, we can talk about a Renaissance state and Renaissance ideas of politics. We can talk about the Renaissance economy. We can talk about the Renaissance discovery. Columbus was part of the Renaissance. We could talk about Renaissance diplomacy and indeed Renaissance warfare. The scientific revolution was part of the Renaissance. Copernicus wrote his famous book in 1543, which is at the height of the Renaissance. Renaissance ideas of modern individualism and self-development and human flourishing unify the writing of this entire time period. Very, very modern in spirit, not something that we saw in the Middle Ages. Turning quickly now to the Reformation, again with the idea that this will be helpful for you as you study for your exam. I want to talk a little bit about Martin Luther. Luther was very interesting. He was a complicated man. He was very, very medieval in some ways, super religious, fire and brimstone, hell and damnation, On the other hand, he was very modern in some ways. His views on women as being equal to men in a women being equal to men in a relationship. His views on individual people being able to interpret the Bible for themselves are very, very modern ideals. So he's kind of got one foot in the Middle Ages and one foot in the modern period. Again, continuities and discontinuities. He's a little bit of both. He's a complicated man. The Reformation begins in 1517, which is, just a little over 500 years ago, when Martin Luther nails this document to the door of a church and says, I object to these principles. He wasn't trying to create a revolution. He was trying to work within the spirit of reform. However, the church did not take kindly to that. What happens after that is the floodgates become unleashed. After Luther, we see other Protestant reformers like Calvin and Zwingli. We see the Reformation in England. A lot of people ask the question, how is it possible that the Reformation could have happened when it did? I like to reframe that. I think the question is not how could the Reformation have happened when it did. Rather, the question is, how come it did not happen sooner? Early Christianity had divisions long ago in terms of orthodoxy. We saw that in the lecture on early Christianity. Throughout the Middle Ages, we see a tradition of reform, disunity, and heresy in the church. So it's nothing new. What made this one different? Well, the answer, I think, is printing and the spread of the Bible. I think that the spread of Renaissance ideas made this more possible. And finally, a new emerging middle class that was more interested in new ways of thinking about religiosity. I'm not one of those historians who looks at one cause. I like to look at multi-layered causes. So there are a variety of reasons why this Reformation really drove a large dividing line in Christianity. From this point on, we have to talk about Catholicism and not just Christianity in general. We talk about Lutherans, we talk about Protestants, we talk about Calvinists. Okay? Martin Luther in 1517, over the issue of indulgences, which the textbook talks about, won ardent supporters, indicating that time was right for this kind of thing. And he was protected by the German princes, who were very, very willing to assert their authority over and against the Holy Roman Empire and the powers of the Pope. He, however, was not a revolutionary. The peasants in Germany thought that he was a revolutionary, and in 1524, they tried to have a revolution. Luther pulled back his support, not that he ever gave them support. He was not concerned with social and political revolution. Luther says that, in contrast to Christianity of the older sort, that by faith alone, you will be saved. That's one of the key points of contemporary Protestantism. Individuals can now read and interpret the Bible for themselves in German, in French, in English, in Dutch. This removed priests as intermediaries between religious truth and the individual person. And this, of course, leads to more individualism. If I can read the Bible for myself, I don't need a priest telling me what's going on. Luther repudiates much of church doctrine, as do many of the other Protestant denominations. The clergy are not special. If faith alone is sufficient, you don't need a priest to mediate on your behalf in front of God. And he pushes the princes for political reform. John Calvin follows very quickly in Switzerland. In 1536, he writes one of his big books called The Institutes. His doctrine of predestination was very, very interesting. I won't get into that. But Calvinism becomes very, very important in England. And Calvinism becomes the doctrine of the Puritans, who eventually settled in Boston after 1630. So Calvin is an interesting development here. In England, we see Henry VIII, whose issue is not so much theological, but one of practicality. He needs to have a male heir to the throne. In 1534, he declares the Act of Supremacy, whereby he, as the King of England, can be in charge of the church in England. That doesn't go so well in terms of what the church wanted to see happen. He dies, and then Elizabeth, great Queen Elizabeth, who gives name to the Elizabethan period in British history, in the time of Shakespeare and so forth, takes control, and under her auspices, the Church of England develops, which is, we call it the Anglican Church today. In the United States, it's called Episcopalianism. But in many ways, it's very similar to Catholicism. But there are big differences, but it's now a separate entity. So we see that solution developing in England, and it's very much part of our American tradition as well. Now, it follows this time period here is lots of fighting and lots of war. In 1555, there is the Peace of Augsburg. Augsburg is a small city in Germany. And the terms of this peace treaty say that each prince can determine the religion in his region, which gives rise to kind of a checkerboard pattern in Central Europe throughout the Holy Roman Empire, what we today might refer to as Germany. This is good short term. It's a win for Protestantism and also for Catholicism. Catholicism stays very, very strong in southern Germany, Bavaria, the Munich area, even to this day. But it also means that Germany will not be unified. It leads to German political disintegration. Germany does not unify until the middle of the 19th century. And one reason why this is the case is because of the politics following the religious disputes here. Another development after the Reformation is the Counter-Reformation. There are a number of things to take note here in the textbook. First of all, it's the Council of Trent, which begins in 1545 and is held in successive years after that. They reassert the idea of the seven sacraments. They say justification by faith, yes, but also by good works. You know, there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church, which is something that Luther disagreed with. The priesthood is, in fact, a special state. Celibacy of the priesthood is maintained, still a debate today. The doctrine of transubstantiation is reaffirmed. That means that in the Catholic Mass, when the priest, does his particular, prayers, that the wafer is literally turned into the body of Jesus, and the wine is literally turned into the blood of Jesus. Scripture and tradition for Catholics after Trent are on equal footing. Okay, it denied the right of people to interpret Scripture on their own, which is why even today Catholics are supposed to follow what the Pope says. You don't see that tradition in Protestant denominations. The idea of monasticism, of monks living in monasteries, is upheld. Purgatory as an idea is reaffirmed. The cult of veneration of saints is reaffirmed. The cult of the Virgin Mary is reaffirmed. And the use of images and relics in churches. Protestant churches are noticeably devoid of relics and images of religious figures. There's a series of reforming popes. St. Ignatius Loyola founds a religious order that is known as the Jesuits. We all know about the Jesuits today, very, very important. Our current pope is a Jesuit. The Jesuits, run, Boston College down the street from our college. They developed the Index of Prohibited Books. Catholics can't read certain things. They could be scientific, they could be philosophical, they could be literary, but if you wanted to publish something, you needed to have the approval of the church hierarchy. It also means the beginning of a new phase of the Inquisition. There were different Inquisitions in the past. This is the Roman Inquisition in 1542, where people would be tried, put on trial, not always executed, sometimes executed, for holding heretical ideas. Okay? Another thing that follows the Reformation is almost 100-year period of war. We call this the Wars of Religion collectively, from around the 1530s, 1540s, up to about the 1650s. Netherlands, Spain, England, France, throughout the continent of Europe, there are wars. I'm not going to get into the specifics of these, and I'm not going to hold you responsible for this for the test either. One particular war is the 30 Years' War, which goes from 1618 to 1648. I'm not going to get into the specifics of this war either, but this drags in Sweden and all the places in Europe. This ends, however, with something I do want you to know about, and that is the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. The Peace Treaty of Westphalia is important because it gives us the new map of Europe. It's the beginning of modern international relations. And the European state system. Modern international law traces itself to Westphalia. And I would ask you to just look quickly at the map in the textbook on page 530 to see what the world looks like in 1648. I hope this little overview of the Renaissance, Reformation, and its aftermath has been helpful to you. Good luck, and thank you.